Alright, if I have lines on my face, I apologize. This is the very first time I've ever had to struggle with like having the lines from the blinds on my face. I might have them. I don't know. I haven't filmed in forever, so I don't remember struggling with this, but maybe I did. Okay, so today's video is going to be some recent reads of mine. Brief little explanation for where the heck I've been. Just home, chilling. I don't really have any big reason for not having been filming, which is kind of, I guess, anticlimactic for those of you. I've had a few comments from on like the last video I posted, which I think was a December wrap-up, saying, hey, will you be posting anytime soon? And you know, that was a question for me as well. I didn't know if I was going to be posting anytime soon due to a lack of motivation for filming and reading, because spoiler alert for this recent read video, I've been in kind of a reading slump this whole entire year, and it was completely unprecedented and I was not expecting it, and it sucked. Also, I've really gotten in lately to fitness, like working out. I worked out like all of last year because I started my gym membership at the gym I still currently go to last January of 2019. But I actually, like, at the beginning of this year, I found a workout buddy, and we were like, hey, let's actually make a plan of this and just go ham and work on our fitness. And that's what we were doing, you know, until coronavirus came and shut down our gym. Anyway, so now I have time to film because the gym's closed. I'm off work today, which is also another reason why I haven't been filming a lot, is because I don't get a lot of days off, and when I do, I'm very selfish with them and I want to sleep in, and then I usually take the rest of that day to do like household things rather than filming. So that's really all the reasons why I've been gone. I'm so sorry, but I'm back. Who knows for how long? Let's just talk about the books I've read so far in 2020. I have read 6 books total. One of them, some of y'all might fight me on even being a book, but you know, I count it. But let's start with the first one. The first book I finished this year is The Vanderbeekers of 141st Street by Karina Yan Glaser. I finished this book January 5th, so I was like, wow, 5 days into the new year and I already have a book finished. I am on my game. And then it like super went downhill, like the most steepest decline. Anyway, this is the first book in a middle grade series surrounding this family called the Vanderbeekers, and in this book there's 5 children and a mom and dad, and they live in Harlem, New York, and they're about to have to find a new place to live because their landlord, for whatever reason, his name is Mr. Biederman, is not going to be renewing their lease, and so they have 5 days. Well, it just says here it's 5 days before Christmas, but I think they have until New Year's to move out. But the Vanderbeeker children want to change Mr. Biederman's mind by like being nice to him and doing these super nice gestures for him, and they don't always go according to plan. So it is comical, it's heartwarming, it's just a very precious middle grade story. I think this would be a great middle grade book, especially for younger readers, like I would say maybe 8, 9 years old. But yeah, I liked it. And there's more books in the series that I definitely want to get to. The reason why I even picked this book up was I was just browsing my middle grade aisles around the beginning of December, and I saw, first of all, the spine. I don't know if you can see it because of the lighting, but I love that font. It just really caught my eye. It was just kind of like fun and cute. And anyway, I picked it up off the shelf and I read the first sentence of the summary, and it says, it's 5 days before Christmas and the Vanderbeeker children should be dreaming about sugar plums and presents. And I was just sold at that point forward because I'd never heard of it, and when I picked it up, like, it doesn't scream Christmas. And honestly, in the actual book, it's not like a super Christmassy book. Like, I think there's one Christmas Eve dinner, but the story really revolves around the children, their different personalities, and what all they think is a nice gesture for Mr. Biederman, which I think also makes this book readable any time of year because it's not like overtly screaming, I'm a holiday read. You know what I mean? So anyway, I really enjoyed it and I would recommend. Alright, so this next book is the book that some of y'all might be like, oh my gosh, I can't believe you're counting that towards your yearly Goodreads total, which if you don't know, my goal this year is to read 40 books, which is a lot for me. Last year I read 38, and I'm like, okay, I'm just gonna make a deal with myself that every year I want to read at least one book more than the previous year, and so I thought 39 was a stupid number, so I was like, let's just make it 40, and it's the year 2020, and 20 plus 20 is 40. math. Like I said, we're not getting off to the greatest start here this year, by any means. My reading, coronavirus, nothing's really going well for me. Anyway, it was Little Women, the official movie companion book. So I got this as an early birthday gift from my mom back in January, because my birthday is at the end of January. And if you don't know Little Women, this movie adaptation came out at the end of December, and I watched it 4 times in the theater. And I have since, like just a couple days ago, it was available to purchase on Apple TV, on my Apple TV, to stream it, whatever. I bought it. I've watched it. I love this movie. It's definitely top 5, if not top 3, if not number 1. But I don't know. I can't knock Dirty Dancing off the number 1 spot of my favorite movies list like that, okay? Dirty Dancing's been number 1 since I was like 8. But man, this is real close. If you're in any way a fan of the movie, if you saw it, this is such a adorable look into the behind the scenes of the movie. You get a little like peek-see into the wet plate photography. There is Marmee. Oh my gosh, Florence Pugh? Is that how you say her last name? She's gorgeous. I loved her portrayal of Amy. Have I even really talked about all that I thought about this movie? Because it's amazing. It even goes through how they filmed the Amy falling through the ice scene, which I thought was so interesting. I literally read every word in this freaking book. We get recipes on how to make peppermint ice cream and Marmee's birthday cake. We even get, like, I don't know what her like name was. Oh, her official job title in this movie was a food stylist. The food had a stylist in this movie. So anyway, I just love this movie and I loved reading about it. I loved reading about the beginning of like this particular book. We read a lot of like the producers and the director giving like the first time they read Little Women and the impact it had on their life. And like Greta Gerwig, the director, talks about all the like letters that Louisa May Alcott wrote about the series, because Little Women is like a book series. I haven't read Joe's Boys or anything beyond Little Women, but I need to. But she was just talking about how Louisa May Alcott only wrote Joe to marry Professor Bear just to appease like fans that were writing like Joe has to get married to Laurie, and she was like, I'm just gonna find her someone totally different. So anyway, I loved reading about it. I just love Little Women, anything revolving around it. I love it, I love it, I love it. And if you haven't read Little Women, if you haven't watched Little Women, get on it. I promise you, you'll at least like it. I don't think anyone has overwhelmingly hating feelings toward, you know, Little Women. Because if you do, what's wrong with you? All right, the next book I've read this year is a Debbie Downer, but it's an amazing 5 stars Debbie Downer, and that's All the Light We Cannot See by Anthony Doerr. Anthony Downer, and I'm just kidding. Anyway, this is a World War II historical fiction book, if you don't know. Super popular. There's probably not a lot of people left in the world who haven't read this book. I bought this in October of 2014, and I finally read it this year. So that just goes to show how long I was dragging my feet in reading this, and I don't know why, because it is just, it's exquisite. This book follows 2 different children into their adolescence. One is a young blind girl living in Paris, France, and the other is an orphaned German boy living in this small mining town. Marie-Laure, I don't know how to say it. That's the name of the French girl, and then Warner is the name of the German boy, and you just get attached to both of these children from the get-go, particularly, I think, due to Anthony Doerr's writing style. I want to write like him so bad. I would say it's long-winded, but in such an okay way, like, because most of the time long-winded isn't said with a lot of, like, adoration for it, but he can take his time writing any book and I'll read it. I've since bought his first, I want to say it was his debut literature work, was The Shell Collector, because it's a collection of short stories, which I thought was so interesting that book is called The Shell Collector, because in this book, Marie-Laure, I'm just gonna call her Marie, she like had an affinity for like mollusks and shells and things like that. But it just kind of, you follow them as they are affected by what happens during World War II, and it is such a piercing story. It will latch onto your soul and crush it little by little. There is a side character in this book named Frederick who was a part of Warner's story. His chapter, if you'll remember, if you've read the book, that was the first time I cried in this book. I cried at multiple different points because it was just such an affecting story. I mean, I don't know how it can't be when you know that this all happened. I mean, it's a fictionalized take, but how fictionalized, you know? Because there is, like, especially in Warner's case, like, I could talk about Warner's plotline for days. His emotional depth for his character, that conflict of wanting to do right, but then also wanting to get out of his small mining town and actually do something with his insane gift. He was a gifted engineer. Would you even go so far to call him like an inventor? He had this knack for repairing radios within like 5 seconds because he was just incredibly smart. And he wanted to do something with that talent, and he knew that if he did what was right in his younger sister's eyes, he would have to stay in that orphanage and, you know, be a miner. Is that what they're called? A coal miner? Yeah. Which is how his dad died. And so obviously that didn't hold a whole lot of appeal for him. Warner is my baby. I was so, like I said, just deeply affected by him in particular, although Marie's story is very, very upsetting too as well. Once this book gets going, it does not let up in terms of how emotional of a roller coaster it is. It's just like loop after loop after loop of, oh my gosh, I'm going to tear my eyes out. I'm so sad. For as sad as it is though, I really don't want that to be like the only thing you can take away from this book. I think it has, I think it's an amazing commentary on war and looking at it from both sides, from the side that's being attacked and from the side that's doing the plotting and attacking. It is so interesting and intricate, and I think it's important to read books like this for a very, very, very long time. So, obviously would recommend it. The next book I picked up this year, it was The 10,000 Doors of January by Alex E. Harrow. If you don't know, I have a little book club. It's super low-key. It's on Goodreads. I'll have the links down below like I always do. Last year I did a book a month, but this year we're doing a book every 2 months, so it's officially a bi-monthly book club because I was struggling to keep up with the books that were being chosen. I do like a poll where I post like 3 or 4 books and then you guys all can vote on the one you want to read, and of course the one that has the most amount of votes is the book that wins for that particular month or for 2020 for the next 2 months. This was the book for January and February. The book for March and April is oh my gosh, I can't talk. It's A Curse So Dark and Lonely by, it's either Brigid or Brigid. Brigid sounds super fancy, so I'm just gonna say it's Brigid Kemmerer. It's a Beauty and the Beast retelling, and I've just really been in the mood to read that book. But anyway, we read this one for January and February. I was super underwhelmed by this book. It's a book about a girl named January who is being raised by this caretaker called Mr. Locke while her father is out exploring and finding these really rare artifacts for Mr. Locke, and she discovers this book called The 10,000 Doors that is a book called The 10,000 Doors. I feel like to explain what the book actually is would be spoiling things, so I'm not gonna say what it is. This book, I'm gonna chalk it up to, I had entirely different expectations for what this book was going to be. I thought it was going to be a book where she is constantly, January is constantly discovering doors and going into different fantastical world after fantastical world, but the book is actually a historical fiction novel, which I knew it took place in like the early 1900s, but I was like, that doesn't bother me. But now having read it, it officially bothers me, just because I don't know what it is, but it just didn't have that magical, fantastical flair that I thought it was going to have, and I'm so sad, because look at this cover. This is definitely a book I want to display on my bookshelf and be like, yes, an amazing read, and a lot of people love this book, so definitely don't take my aversion for it as like the end-all be-all say on it, because the whole reason why I thought I was gonna love it was because of those amazing 5-star reviews of this book. So in this book, it's really super historical fiction, and the only world we really ever go into is this one world, and we go into it through a story being told in past tense until like the very, very, very end. And by the way, I read most of it and then probably skimmed the last 60 to 80 pages. I guess you could say I DNF'd it, but I counted it since I read most of the book. I had a lot of issues too with the beginning when January was a child. Here's just an instance. an example of what happened in this book that I just didn't like agree with because I couldn't understand it. So January is like 9 or 10 years old. She might even be 11, but whatever. She's a child. And Mr. Locke, well, I'm getting ahead of myself. She has a friend. I can't even remember his name. I think his last name was Zappia, if that's how it's pronounced. He gets her like a puppy from someplace. My voice is leaving me. She sneaks it into the house. It's Mr. Locke's house. His house is super nice. He has a lot of very expensive items in his house. So he tells her, no, we can't have a puppy in this house. There's not gonna be anyone to take care of it but you, and you're a child, and I won't be able to look after it. So he basically lays the law down as a caretaker, as a fatherly figure for January, saying, no, we can't have this puppy. And she sneaks it back in and then has the audacity to get upset with him when he gets upset with her for being disobedient. And that was, I think, my main thing. I'm glad I said the word disobedient. The beginning of this book was January being disobedient after disobedient after disobedient to Mr. Locke, and yet it was written to where Mr. Locke was the bad guy. And it's like, I'm sorry, but since when is a person setting ground rules for a child to be taken as the villain for the story? And you know, it was also at war because January wanted to see him as this father figure because her own father was pretty much missing from most of her life, because he would come back every now and then, but he would never stay for long. So I understood why she wanted to see Mr. Locke as this father figure, but like, what makes her think that her actual father, if he was in the same shoes as Mr. Locke, wouldn't have done the same things, like told her not to run away from a hotel they were staying in, a strange town. And then she gets upset when he gets upset with her. I didn't get it. Also, I feel like Mr. Locke being the villain would have been a much more interesting scenario if at the beginning he was only seen as this really doting, attentive father figure for January. Because then later in the book, when you find out he is like a villain, because I mean, you kind of know from the get-go. I hope I'm not, don't take this as spoiling, because I don't consider it a spoiler to say that Mr. Locke's the villain. When you find out he's like really a villain, that would have been more interesting if from that point, like earlier, we would have seen him only through January's like, oh, he takes care of me so well type of eyes. But that didn't happen. So I feel like he was written kind of badly. I will say Alex E. Harrow's writing style is beautiful. She had like amazing metaphors and similes that were so creative, and I'd never read them before. Like there was one where January is waking up and she's been drugged basically. I can't even remember it word for word, but it's her eyes didn't want to open, and when they did, it was like trying to separate two caramels that had melted in your pocket. Like, I don't know, for some reason that one like really stuck with me. It sounds kind of stupid now that I'm saying it out loud, but when I was reading it, I was like, wow, so clever. So it's things like that that I really liked, those little tidbits, but the overall story wasn't up to par with what I imagined it would be, which is just unfortunate, you know? All right, moving on now to the next book I read this year. I read The Queen of Nothing by Holly Black. I read this one actually really recently. I read it. We're into March now. This is the third and final book in the Folk of the Air trilogy. So as far as the summary of this book, I can't get into it. But if you don't know, the Folk of the Air series is a young adult fantasy series that follows our main character Jude, who is a mortal girl living in Elfheim, which is a fairy world, and fairies don't like humans, they don't respect them, and Jude has been raised by her parents' murderer, which is just a horrible setup to begin with. But she's ruthless and she wants to be the ruler of Elfheim pretty much. She just wants to have power. She wants to establish dominance over a particular group of fairies that have been mean to her at her school. And that's the gist of the first book at least. And then you follow it on. So there's 3 books. It's completed. Unfortunately, as a fan, I loved the way this book ended, but I wished it would have been longer. Like I really wish there would have been more to this book. And because there's not more to this book, I really wish there would be like, I don't know, a follow-up novella or just a whole nother novel. This book is like 305 pages. That is so short for a conclusion to a fantasy series. I still gave it 4 out of 5 stars because I read this book as a fan. I mean, you don't get to a 3rd book in a trilogy of a series and you're not a fan of it. So as a fan, I loved the way everything ended, would so recommend. As an objective reader though, it was kind of a mess. There were scenes that should have been longer, and specifically in the case of Jude's relationship with her twin sister Taryn, I just feel like what happened in this book totally negated everything else that happened in the previous 2 books. It was as if the previous 2 books weren't building up to something, and this book totally just like forgot that. So that part of this book really, like, I didn't understand it. And that was another thing. How we got to the end of this book, I'm getting like really heated about it while I love it. So anyway, by the time we got to the end and everything was happening, there was so much that I feel like should have been included as to give reasons behind why they were happening. And there were things that would happen, but like so fast, and then we'd move to the next thing, and we're just like, was that given the proper weight it needed to have an impact on the story? Like, so from the objective standpoint, that was what was wrong with it for me. But again, I love Jude and Cardan, and we got plenty of Jude and Cardan love. Actually, not plenty, you know? We should have gotten a little bit more. I love, like, how they treat each other. I know it's so toxic, it's super unhealthy, but that's why I like reading about it, because I know it's fictional and I would never ever want to be a part of a relationship like that. But there's something about reading it where you're just like, oh my gosh, it's like a train wreck, but the most beautiful, luxurious train wreck you've ever seen. So anyway, I would honestly, as a whole, I would recommend the series. My favorite book in the series, now that I've read it all, definitely is the second book, The Wicked King, although the first book, Cruel Prince, has the best plot twist ever. And you know what? Since I feel like I trashed this book, I will include that I love the way Holly Black will let her story get to like the bottom of the barrel in terms of how it's looking for her characters. I mean, they will have nothing going for them about 3/4 of the way through. And so as a reader, you're like, how the heck is Holly Black going to end this? How is she going to bring any sort of sunlight back into the dark, dark depths of the book? And somehow she does. Except for The Wicked King. But you know what? I'm not gonna go there. I love reading books like that where you just genuinely can't think of how an author's gonna end a story. If you want a book that's gonna be like that, you should definitely read The Cruel Prince. Alright, moving on to the 6th and final book I've read so far in 2020. That book is called The City of Veils by S. Usher Evans. This is the first book in a fantasy series. I think the series is called Princess Vigilante series? It just says it's a Princess Vigilante novel. Okay, so I work at a bookstore, and this is a local author here in Pensacola, and she came by. She was gonna have an author signing event, but it got canceled, of course, because of coronavirus. But I still wanted to read it just in case it was still on, because it was for the 31st, but that's in just a few days, so it's not happening. It follows our main character, Brenna. She is a princess, but she kind of like ran away from her royal duties when she was 13 before being forced to marry like a neighboring kingdom's future king, because she didn't want any part of that. So she ran away and she trained to become like this vigilante. I wouldn't say she's like an assassin. I don't know if that's the right word. It just says as a masked vigilante. I would think like Batman, but as a girl. Batgirl, Batwoman. Does that already? I think that already exists. But at the beginning of the book, the king and prince, so her father and brother, get poisoned and therefore die. And so she gets approached by the captain of the King's Guard, Felix, and is like, hey, you have to come back because you're gonna have to be crowned queen in 3 months. And she's like, what? So that's how this story basically is. So there's kind of 2 different plot threads we're following. We are following who murdered, ooh, can you see my sweat stains? Who murdered the king and prince. She, as a masked vigilante, she was following this slumlord businessman called Lord Beswick. I thought this book was it was really okay. I just realized something about myself. I've never read a fantasy that didn't factor in magic, and you know what I realized? I want magic. I felt like that was a huge thing missing for me in this book. There was always just something off about the whole story to me. This is such a personal taste. I know that there are probably a lot of people, a lot of readers out there who actually prefer fantasy sans magic. I am not one of those. I love magic. If it's gonna be fantasy, just why not make it magical? I just don't get it. So if you want a good fantasy series or a good fantasy read that is without magic, this could be a viable option. A couple things about this book too that didn't really like do it for me is there were a couple instances of modern day slang language. I'll give you the examples. The first one was, I think it was Felix who was talking to Brenna saying, "Are you salty about this?" And she's like, "Oh yeah, I'm very salty about it." And you know, salty, if not describing the water of the ocean, typically means to be annoyed or frustrated. And like, that's quite a newer term to be in use. So in a fantasy setting, it didn't seem right. And then also the second one was, again, I think it was between Felix and Brenna. He said something about, "You don't have enough finesse." And she's like, "Oh please, I have plenty of finesse." That's also a word that I associate heavily with my 15-year-old boy cousin who one Christmas a couple years ago, literally that was the only word he ever said was, "I've got so much finesse." So that kind of jolted me from the story as well, because I don't normally think of my 15-year-old cousin when I read fantasy novels and hear him saying the word finesse. So anyway, those are just like some things that for me, I'd rather not see in a fantasy. But then of course, like, what's the rule of fantasy? Can they have, you know, millennial phrases, or I guess that would be Gen Z phrases stuck in there? Who knows? I mean, at the end of the day, you're the author of your own fantasy series, am I right? Yeah, I thought the world building though was great. The way it was done wasn't. Our main character gets these history lessons from the prince's wife, who's now not his wife anymore because he's dead. So his widow, she like literally gives our main character history lessons of their kingdom and the neighboring kingdoms. And I'm sorry, if it's like a history lesson for your main character, it is surefire a history lesson for the reader. So that was not the most fun way to do world building and info dumping, in my opinion. But thankfully there was only like 2 chapters where that happened, and the rest of it was done through like dialogue. But yeah, I ended up, I think on Goodreads, giving this a 3 out of 5 stars. But yeah, just a lot of the things that I realized about myself and what I prefer in my fantasies didn't happen in this book, and that's really why I'm kind of giving it a middle of the road. But I think if all of what I just said does not affect you at all, then you could really love this book. So I would recommend. I've seen there are Goodreads reviews for this book that say it's like Batman meets Robin Hood, and I think that's a really apt comparison. And that's one thing that made me want to take this book home, is because the idea of this book was so interesting. I like the idea of this princess being this masked vigilante fighting for her kingdom, not as a princess, you know? Yeah, those are all the books I've read so far this year in 2020. I'm so hoping to pick up my reading, especially since I have enough time. I still am going to work right now because apparently I'm an essential employee. I don't work at a grocery store. I'm also not a nurse, so I don't think I'm in like high trafficked areas. I also live in Florida, where I think right now we're like the 5th or 6th state with the most coronavirus cases, but I do not live in the Miami area. Thank you, Jesus, because it just seems so scary down there. I'm thankful to still have a job to be able to go to. I'm thankful to be still making an income, earning an income. This is definitely a good time to just pray a lot with all the time we're spending indoors, because obviously on my days off, I'm here, not going anywhere. So yeah, hope you guys liked this video. Hope you guys still want to watch my videos. I'm like, what is BookTube anymore? What's sad is I haven't been filming, and I also haven't been watching it as often. I've been watching a few videos here and there, but yeah, please welcome me back. It's good to be back. So I'll see you guys hopefully in the next video relatively soon. Bye.